Good evening, everyone. Welcome back once again to our very special lecture series on modernism, 1922 2022, 100 years and beyond. First of all, we would like to begin by thanking all of you for your very warm appreciation for our first lecture, which was on 7th of December, given by none other than Professor Sam Sloat. Professor Sloat was very happy with the responses he had received. And we at the Center for Distance and Online Education Department of English, Rabindra Bharati University, were also very happy that you turned up in such huge numbers to listen to Professor Sloat, both on Zoom and on Facebook. Today is our second talk. It would be delivered by Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay. And I would now hand over the session to my colleague Rishiraj Pal, who would introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Aristro. We have with us today Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay. Welcome here, Orko. Orko Chattopadhyay is Assistant Professor of Literary Studies and Philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar, India. He has written his MPhil thesis on Samuel Beckett and Alain Badiou, and finished his PhD from Western Sydney University on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis with a Dean's Thesis Prize. He has been published in books like Deluge and Beckett, Knots, Post-Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Literature and Film, Gerald Mernin, Another World in This One, etc., and journals such as Textual Practice, Interventions, Samuel Beckett Today, or Aujourd'hui, Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, Sound Studies, and the Harold Pinter Review. He has co-edited the book Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature, and has guest edited SBT/A issue on Samuel Beckett and the Extension of the Mind. Dr. Chattopadhyay is the founding editor of the online literary journal that we are all familiar with, Shonglap, and a contributing editor to Harold Pinter Review. His first monograph, Beckett, Lacan, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real, has been published by Bloomsbury Academic UK in 2019. He has recently co-edited a volume on Navarun Bhattacharya for Bloomsbury India in 2020, and is working on a monograph on post-humanism, contracted by Orient Black Swan, and 2 edited volumes on effective ecologies and Badiou and modernism. He has recently been selected as the Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow 2022-23 by Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, University of Edinburgh, for his project on Bengali modernism and decoloniality. His talk today is titled A Literary Modernism and Scientific Modernity. The talk will discuss the interface of literary modernism and scientific modernity in the 20th century Europe, when literature acquires a desire to become scientific. In this inclination, is this inclination positivist, or does modernism find a way to critique scientific rationality? The talk will address this question, and to do so, it will go through multiple modernist works and critical discourses to situate science, physics, chemistry, medical biology, and mathematics as metaphor, as form, as conceptual support, and as experiment. Over to you, Orko. We are really eager for your talk.
Thank you so much, first of all, Orithro and Rishiraj. I hope I'm visible and audible, sufficiently audible.
Yes.
Visibility, secondability is important, right? Okay, perfect. And first of all, thank you so much to both of you and all the organizers who have put together, as we were discussing before the beginning of the event, such a wonderful and quite an exceptional seminar series on modernism, perhaps the first one to be happening this year in the centennial year of 1922, in India at least. So it's a great joy and privilege for me to be part of this seminar series and deliver something which has been, at least so far, a bit of a lifelong project, I must say. And it's still a work in progress. So there will be lots of things to discuss, I suppose, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the questions you might have, the comments that you might have about the presentation. So just to start, from where I'm coming from, to give you an idea from where I'm coming from. So, I mean, my doctoral work was essentially looking at philosophy of mathematics within, let's say, the historical sequence of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which was concomitant with, at least late modernism. I mean, if we look at the historical connections, in fact, what is very interesting is that Lacan's movement outside medical psychiatry in pursuit of Freudian psychoanalysis started when he became one of the members, at least informally, one of the members of the Surrealist group, the Surrealist circle. It was his association with literature and literary writers, particularly speaking Surrealists, that initiated his movement outside medical psychiatry and a movement towards psychoanalysis, to the extent that sometimes, somewhat mistakenly, he has been called a surrealist, which may or may not be the case, simply because he did not pursue a career in creative writing. He was, always a clinician first and foremost. So anyway, there are literary bridges there between psychoanalysis in that sense, which has a certain, at least initial connection with the, let's say, with the problem of science. And I'll talk about why I'm using the word problem for science. So in a sense, this is what I've been working on at least for the last 10 years. But the work has, of course, progressed beyond the doctoral project. And I'm currently looking a little more expansively about the notion of mathematical subjectivity. So I'll try and explain technical terms throughout the talk as much as possible without assuming too many, technical initiations on the part of the audience. When I say mathematical subjectivity, I mean a sense of self or an identity, a human identity, that is built around some sort of an identification with mathematics as a discourse. The dumbest and simplest example of that would be, let's say, a maths teacher or a mathematician, right? Someone who is, in a disciplinary sense, engaged with the study of mathematics. Someone who teaches mathematics at some pedagogic level, whether in school or college or university, doesn't matter. But that's the most obvious example. If we look at the very diverse set of humanities approaches to mathematics that have, been developed in the last 10 to 20 years, more or less, there's a lot of work now that exists talking about science and literature, right? They're not considered as almost oppositional to each other as they were considered once upon a time. Of course, there has been a lot of work on sociology of science, how science, despite assuming a certain kind of universality, is also contingent on socio-historical conditions. This is a particular, let's say, truism now in the field called sociology of science, where a lot of great researchers for a long time have been doing their work. I mean, one notable name, sadly, he passed away recently, is Bruno Latour. If you are aware of Latour's early work, unlike the late work, which goes more into actor network theory and questions of system, his doctoral work was on philosophy of science, and more specifically on sociology of science, talking about exactly what I mentioned there in terms of the social and political conditioning of science as a discourse. Even though science would like to usually assume this universal character and erase the specificity which is contingent on social realities and sometimes even political realities. I mean, for example, again, to talk about the great work of the Indian philosopher Sundar Sarukkai. Sundar Sarukkai has made this argument time and again across his long and illustrious career as a philosopher of science, that on the one hand, a discourse like mathematics, right, tries to erase its dependency on natural language. By natural language, I mean, the language of alphabets that we know, whatever language it might be. Mathematics and the history of mathematics tends to assume a kind of independence from natural language. It tries to situate itself as a language on its own, which is completely autonomous of natural language, human language, let's say. But again, as Sarukkai has shown through his magnificent work in a number of articles that I can't go into, but of course, if you're interested, you could look them up. It's also an argument he has made in bits and pieces in the introductory book, What is Science? The argument being that there is such a dependency. There is a dependency of mathematical discourse on natural language. And it's a dependency that mathematical discourse historically has erased and in a strong sense denied, perhaps. So again, we are talking about the supposed universality of science on the one hand, and its social, political, contingent factors on the other hand, right? And these are the factors that have really come into being when we are talking about the humanities approach to sciences. So again, to go back to that point about mathematical subjectivity, it's not just a mathematician who has a mathematical subjectivity or a maths teacher. In fact, we all are mathematical subjects in a certain way. And again, I'm thinking of, again, the work of a great modernist who has talked about this idea of vernacular mathematics. Again, I won't go into too many details, but the simple point, let me try and make this point through a real life example. If you think about the manipulations with numbers that we do on an everyday level, there's a certain way in which mathematics is part of our everyday life. If we boil it down to the fundamental operation of manipulation with numbers, counting. Think about the kind of OTPs that we have to deal with on a regular basis. Interestingly, if you think about OTPs, it's not a paradigm of number as counting, but a paradigm of number as cross-matching. We are essentially looking at numbers and then feeding them back into another system. We are not calculating anything. It's also very interesting and very Cartesian, perhaps, that when there is a security risk in websites, we are asked to prove our human identity. And very often, there'll be a very simple mathematical equation there, not an equation, a simple task of addition. And, it will go 8 plus 4, you have to write what it is, 12, or if you're bad in adding, 10, 8, whatever, right? But the point I'm trying to make is, even in the era of the digital discourses, mathematics at the fundamental level of calculation remains the factor that makes us human, the activity that makes us human. And I mentioned Descartes because, of course, Descartes and Kant and many of these classical Western philosophers would talk about this idea of mathesis universalis as a distinguishing quality of human beings vis-a-vis other living beings. So there would be this classic species humanist assumption that only human beings are capable of complex matrices, complex calculations, let's say. So again, to go back to the point I started with, mathematical subjectivity does not necessarily mean a professional identity and doesn't necessarily mean a technical identity either. Mathematical subjectivity could be a lay subjectivity, a subjectivity of the every man or every woman or every person, so to speak. Now, so increasingly in terms of my own interest, I've sort of gravitated towards that idea of mathematical subjectivity and what that means in literary representations of such within the historical period of literary modernisms, primarily in Europe, but also correspondingly in a certain sense in India. I'll briefly make a departure and get into the core points in the talk. But what I tried to show, in a sense, through my doctoral work using Beckett as a case study was this dialectic that I just mentioned, that mathematics being, in a sense, the most privileged of all hard sciences, I'm not talking about technology here or engineering for that matter, that's a different domain altogether. I'm talking about the basic sciences, right? In the basic sciences, there's a certain assumption that mathematics, and perhaps rightly so, that mathematics is the hard science or basic science par excellence, because even when it comes to physics or chemistry, the language in which that discourse is shaped, formally speaking, is a mathematical language. I mean, biology is a slightly different ballgame. We'll come to that. But I'm going to primarily restrict myself to the basic sciences and think about how they are deployed as tropes in modernist texts, how modernist writers are responding to this desire in the early 20th century of making literature scientific. And we'll talk about the complications of that desire, the let's say the double-edged sword that desire could become. Anyway, but coming back to the point I was going to make about the autonomy of mathematical discourses. So in a certain sense, and again, as students of literature, students of modernism, it's a bit of a critical commonplace to say that formalism, formalization, not in a dehistoricized sense, but in a very deeply historical sense, formalism or formalization remains one of the central pointers of experimentalism in modernism. Modernism essentially tries to reinvent literary forms with each iteration of the novel or poem or theater, whatever form or genre we are talking about. And it tries to create new forms within each genre in that sense. So looking at this very strong formalist interest within modernism, that's where mathematics and even physics to a large extent becomes a very important reference point for a whole host of writers. And we'll talk about some of them. A lot of writers take their cue from this supposed autonomy of sciences, supposed universality of sciences, and this idea of autonomy, which comes into question, but at the same time gets theorized within modernism. If you think about, for example, the theory of the avant-garde, the classic, there is a certain notion that modernism aspires towards an autonomous text. And I'm talking about the anti-realistic tendencies within literary modernism. Okay, so very simply, we'll not write a text, or the agenda will be not to write a text that corresponds with reality, but a text that not only constructs reality, in fact, it does not have any mimetic relation with reality. This is in one of those critical commonplaces about modernism, which I'm sure almost all of you would be familiar with. Now, when it comes to these very broad-brushed strokes or inclinations within modernism, mathematics, very specifically, because that's the core interest of mine, to be honest, but also physics and chemistry in a certain way, as we shall see, becomes a very important reference point, because science, in a way, to put it very bluntly, is used by certain modernist writers as a sort of discourse for formal experimentation. So science, and especially mathematical formalization, becomes the privileged form of formalization, even for literature. And I mean, the most obvious example of this would be Oulipo. We'll talk a little bit about Oulipo, but even otherwise, we see this quite strongly present in modernist literature, even in writers who are perhaps not as explicitly mathematizing the entire form of their work, but even writers like Joyce, for example, who can forget that wonderful word, in line with so many of his coinages in Ulysses, muse mathematics, right? Muse mathematics is the word that he uses as a sort of portmanteau word in Ulysses. But how does mathematics become a muse? Again, if we think about Yeats and his great poem Statues, it begins with counting, begins with numbers, right? We could go on and on with examples, but that's not what I'm trying to do here. Just to give you an idea that for modernism, because literary form became such an important question, in a certain sense, scientific form, especially the form of matter coming in from physics, and of course, mathematical formalization as a language on its own, they became paramount to appeal to for a lot of modernists. Not everyone, of course, but for a lot of modernists. And their attempt to appeal to science was essentially part of this laboratory approach of formal experimentation. But there was also this underlying assumption there that mathematics will give us an autonomous form, a form that does not have to depend mimetically on a certain structure of reality outside the text. But what I tried to show with Beckett is the paradox of this appeal. On the one hand, this appeal was made, but on the other hand, there's also a realization increasingly that mathematics cannot offer that autonomous form, because the idea of a completely autonomous form is an illusion. So that's essentially what I tried to show with the readings of Beckett that I did. But since then, I've been looking at, as I said, other writers alongside Beckett, someone like Calvino, who we will talk about today, at least mention briefly, and also, the Oulipians, going back to some of the more canonical modernists as well, of course. But let me just begin now with what I want to do today, which is essentially an overview to sort of address that question that Rishiraj spelled out initially in the not so well-written description that I must say I kind of wrote in a jiffy. So essentially, the point that I would like to address here is the question of positivism, or what is also called scientism in the language of philosophy sometimes. What does it mean? It means, again, this assumption, it refers to this assumption that science is the only discourse to truth. And science is a verificatory discourse. Every other discourse can verify its value, its cultural value from science. And again, it's a very simple point that all of us encounter every single day, right? I mean, there's often this use of the word scientific to essentially mean it's justified, the writing or the point being made is justified. Very often we use this kind of language, and we question something by saying, okay, but is that scientific? So scientific becomes a synonym for logical, something systematic, something logical, something justified in its own shape, something which is not inconsistent. And there is a certain cultural prevalence of science, of course, and that's something that can very easily make literature's appeal towards science positivistic or scientistic, as I'm saying. But is that the only way in which modernists appeal towards science? Is the desire for a scientific status for literature essentially a gesture of scientism or a gesture of positivism? Or is there a way in which one could have an anti-systemic use of science in literary modernism? So that's essentially the question I want to ask. If it's completely positivist and scientistic, it becomes embedded into the system of science. Is that the only way we are supposed to understand literary modernism's appeal towards sciences in general, and specifically modern mathematics in particular, because that's where they go most. And I'm not saying this because of my interest. Historically, that's where they go the most. And then comes physics, and then a little bit of chemistry, and maybe just a tad bit of medical biology. Anyway, we'll talk about them one by one. Let me just begin with a reference. Just give me a second. Let me see if I can share my screen. I don't have a PowerPoint, but there's some longish passages, but it seems like there's a setting thing with the screen share. Yeah, now I can share. Thank you. I'll just quickly share, because it's a longish quotation. It'll be easier, I suppose, if I share. Just let me know if you're able to. Actually, sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, I hope you can see the slide, right? Okay, wonderful. So this is just, it's a long quote. I won't read everything, but it's very interesting. And I must say, I'm also new to this particular text and this passage. This is one of the posthumous collections of essays by Calvino, and it's called The Collection of Sand. And in that book, there's a particular essay, as you can see, called Say It With Knots. Now, in this essay, I mean, there are many essays in this volume where Calvino is talking about a series of exhibitions he has seen and he has witnessed because they were organized by some of his friends. And in this case, this is an exhibition about knots. Now, again, without going into too many technicalities, what is very interesting is that not only is Calvino attuned to the exhibition and the point that knot is a mathematical object for geometry, he's also aware of, let's say, the classically speaking non-science use of the knot structure in Lacanian psychoanalysis, as we can see here. Again, let me not, as Calvino also says, dare to try defining in my own words the relationship of the Borromean knot to the unconscious. That's a completely different discussion. We can have some other time. But let me dwell on the next point that he makes, because I think it's very, very important for Calvino's own artistic practice as a writer. But I would try to formulate, Calvino says, the geometrical and spatial idea I've managed to draw from it. Draw from what? Draw from Lacan's use of the Borromean knot as a geometric object in his psychoanalytic teachings. What does Calvino draw from this? And this is where it becomes really interesting. The three-dimensional space actually has 6 dimensions, since everything changes according to whether one dimension passes above or below another, or to the right or left of the other, just like in a knot. So in order to make a knot, we have to use rings, which are not tied, of course, in the form of rings. I mean, technically speaking, these are infinite lines, and you have to bend them, right? You have to bend them, make them into circles, let one circle go into another one, twist one circle to make it go through another one. And that's how a knot is formed. Borromean knot is a very particular kind of knot, as Calvino defines rightly here, where there are minimum 3 rings. And if there are 3 rings linked together, any 2 are linked by the third. But the third could be any of the 3. Essentially, the idea is it's not like the Olympic knots, where you cut the, one of the rings on either side, and the other 2 still remain intact. But in a Borromean knot or in a Brownian link, that's the more technical term, mathematically speaking, you cut any of the 3 rings and the other 2 will dissolve. So the knot, the entire chain in that sense, will dissolve if you cut any of the 3 rings. And 3 is the minimum number with which you can make a Borromean knot. You cannot make it with 2 rings. So it's not the Olympic knot. Anyway, just going into what Calvino extracts from this, the 3-dimensional space having 6 dimensions, and he goes on, as we can see here. This is because in knots, the intersection between 2 curves is never an abstract point, but is the actual point where one end of a rope or cord or line or thread or string either runs or turns or is tied above or below or around itself or around another similar term. I know that this might sound a little bit confusing for those who are not aware of this particular knot structure, but let's not go into those technicalities. The point that I want to highlight is simply this gesture from a literary writer who is extracting something about physics, the physics of space and spatiality, from a geometric structure like the Borromean knot, as it is used by a psychoanalyst. So not a traditional scientific, in that sense, use of the mathematical structure. Why did I say this is very important for Calvino as a writer? Again, I can't go into all the details of this, but for anyone who is familiar with Calvino's, especially Cosmicomics, I mean, that's the one book I'll single out, which is most relevant perhaps, but also some of the earlier parables, some of the initial parables he wrote, which have a very strong figuration of space. In fact, there's this memorable story in Cosmicomics which imagines all the world and all the people in the world to be located on a single geometric point with 0 dimensionality. So this is something that Calvino always plays with. this absolute contraction of space, and this absolute expansion of space, these two registers of spatial contraction and expansion. And so anyway, I just wanted to use Calvino's thoughts on this to give you some sort of an idea of how these thoughts are triggered from a particular mathematical structure, as I said, not used by a traditional scientist at least, and how it goes into a certain physics of spatiality from that mathematical structure. Let me move on. We are going to go back in time quite a bit, in fact, to mention another representation of a different kind of science, in this case, medical biology. Emile Zola writes this very influential essay in 1893, which is again very interesting as an essay because he defines the term experiment, of course, taking the cue from the sciences, which is why I'm talking about this essay, but it's also a political definition of the experimental novel, which will please someone like Lukács, who otherwise has, more than a fight to pick with modernism for being politically passive or ambiguous. But someone like Zola is in Lukács's, let's say, not in Lukács's hit list, and someone he likes, because again, there's a sort of broadly socialist, left-wing, politically progressive imagination of the experimental novel. But that's not why I'm talking about this essay, which is again a very long and complex essay. I just have some quotes here. I won't read out everything, but you can read it for yourself as I talk about the central idea here. So Zola takes the notion of experiment from a 19th century biologist, Claude Bernard, who is mentioned here, if you can see. Claude Bernard is the reference point when it comes to Zola's essay. Throughout, he frames the notion of the experimental novel following Claude Bernard. And as you can see, right at the outset, we have that desire that I was talking about, literature's desire to be governed by science, to become science, in a certain sense. But is Zola not aware of the deterministic implications of this argument? That if literature is actually governed by science, would it not become too exact, too unambiguous, too flat? He is aware of this. In fact, if you read the essay closely, you would see that throughout the essay, he talks about, in fact, that's why I had this second quote here, where he talks about determinism. So throughout the essay, he makes this point that at least medical biology, because it's an experimental field, it's more creative and literary. And this is a point made by many medical humanists who appeared in the scene at least 100 years from Zola, who keep making this central fundamental claim that medicine is a very creative discipline. I mean, of course, one can say that about the other hard sciences as well. But at that point, when Claude Bernard writes his famous book on experimental medicine, medicine hasn't really developed the way it has right now in 2022. And there's a lot of conjecture happening in medicine. Perhaps even now there is some conjecture, even in the era of evidence-based medicine, evidence-based therapy, and so on. But the essential point is biology is not given the same value that physics or chemistry is given. And we have a little bit of that shadowed here in the second quote. But the essential point out from this is that for Emile Zola, the notion of experimental novel or literary experimentation comes on top of scientific experimentation. Okay, so to continue, Zola's experimental novel takes after this medical notion of experiment coming from biology. And that's the essential point I'm trying to make. Is that deterministic? Yes, possibly. But the way Zola works around that allegation of determinism is that medicine, or science in this case, is not about the why. It's not about causality. It's about the how. It's about the process. It's not about the why, but about the how. And that's one of the ways in which, he talks about, as you can see in the second quote, in the second paragraph, talks about a pluralistic kind of a determinism, where it's not that one particular cause is found out to be the only cause for a particular manifestation, a medical manifestation of a symptom, let's say. Uh, in this the last longish paragraph that I have here, again, I had this paragraph up because it gives us, in a nutshell, the point about the definition of the experimental novel, that the writer will take the characters in the narrative world through a series of social situations to evoke a certain kind of evolution, a social political progress of the character. And in a sense, that's how, and that's why Zola presents the experimental novelist as a sort of savant, as a social doctor, as a doctor for the social maladies, so to speak, the political maladies, so to speak, the malady of injustice, the malady of oppression. That's what the literary novelist has to treat. For someone like Zola to say this in the very beginning of modernism, if you look at the historical period, we are not yet into the 20th century in 1893, and Zola is one of those precursors who kind of is located between a kind of socialist realism and a sort of proto-modernist form. But the last point to make about Zola here is that, and that's a slightly cheeky point, even though throughout the essay, he is absolutely indebted to Claude Bernard, when it comes to Claude Bernard's doctor's idea of literature, Zola completely discards that. And it's actually funny in a certain sense. As you can see here, if I were to define the experimental novel, I should not say, as Claude Bernard says, that a literary work lies entirely in the personal feeling, for the reason that, in my opinion, the personal feeling is but the first impulse. And it goes on to talk about the social and etc. in that scientific idea of experiment. But what is very interesting is that even though he dedicates the entire essay to the altar of Claude Bernard, almost assuming him in this position of some sort of a medical god, the moment Bernard has a certain opinionated position on literature, the writer in Zola militates against that and militates against this idea, which is, of course, for Zola, a left-minded writer, a reactionary idea. Literature cannot be absolutely personal. It cannot be only about personal feelings. That defeats the entire point about the experimental novel. But I wanted to use this essay again as a site of literature's appeal towards science, and very specifically towards medical biology. Let's move on. I'm aware of time, and I'm perhaps taking more time than I should, but I'll be quicker as we move on. Tristan Tzara. So again, so that we do not get mistaken and think that a certain positive approach to science, or a laudatory approach to science, an appreciative approach to science, is the only thing we have in modernism. No, that's certainly not the case. As you can see here, Tzara, in his early 20s, of course, being the rebellious Dadaist modernist poet that he is, when he's writing this manifesto in 1918, let's look at the diatribe against science. It's a complete dismissal. Science disgusts me as soon as it becomes a speculative system, loses its character of utility that is so useless, but is at least individual. I detest greasy objectivity and harmony, the science that finds everything in order. Carry on, my children, humanity. Science says we are the servants of nature. Everything is in order, make love and bash your sin. So again, I mean, of course, there's a certain rawness in these lines, and that's the energetic of Tzara's writing. For those of us who are familiar with his style, there's always this very raw, kinetic energy of language in Tzara's poetry and in his prose. But the important point is, he's not absolutely against science, though he's extremely dismissive. His essential problem lies with the systemic nature of science. When it becomes a speculative system, it loses that character of utility, but then he satirizes that idea of utility as well. Science as utility, science for social development, science for social utility. The other problem that, of course, Zara in his language becomes very attacking, but it's not just Zara. In fact, if you think about the famous dialogue between Rabindranath Tagore and Albert Einstein, this is essentially the fight between the two giants, a literary giant and a scientific giant. It's not possible from within the craft of science for someone like Einstein to entirely accept the kind of subjectivism that Tagore talks about. And on the other hand, it's not possible for Tagore, either as a creative writer, as an artist, to accept that absolute objectivity of science as a discourse. So again, I mean, to put it very simplistically, just for the sake of argument, let's say, we have this idea of subjective humanities and this idea of objective science. But again, is it that simple? Is it that neat binary opposition of objective science and subjective humanities? It seems to be like that, especially in the dialogue that I just mentioned between Einstein and Tagore. But of course, there's something very interesting if you think about the way, again, in modernism, and by modernism, I do not mean just literary modernism, but also the philosophers who were working round about the same time. I mean, we cannot discount the fact that there was a very strong influence on stream of consciousness as a modernist narrative technique that came from, psychology, right? Also from philosophy. Now, if we think about this idea of subjective time, that becomes so central to modernism, especially to the project of someone like Proust, involuntary memory, subjective time. Subjective time is sometimes, in a sense, juxtaposed with the sociological factory time of modernity. Factory and capitalism and the factory time that is introduced, that Marx talks at length about in his theory of surplus value, which is essentially a thesis about the exploitative nature of capitalist time. So on the one hand, we have this seemingly objective capitalist time, a time which is chronological, but at the same time, a time which has lots of gaps in it. And those gaps produce exploitation, and hence the surplus value being produced. But on the other hand, we have this deep meditative kind of a subjective time. Now, when we think about a philosopher who contributes quite centrally to this idea, it's Bergson, right? Henri Bergson. And Bergson's references, if we go back to Bergson's work, are quite strongly taken from physics in a certain sense, the way he talks about time, and especially the famous distinction between time and duration, is, in a way built on top of a certain physics of time. A philosophy that has, certain kinds of implications when we bring in, for example, Einsteinian general relativity. In fact, there's a lot of interesting work that has been done on the modernist idea of time in literature and the contemporaneous scientific developments on space-time. And again, if we think about philosophy broadly, someone like Heidegger is especially in the late work in this volume of Being and Time, the philosophy of the event, he's talking about space-time exactly in that sense that Einstein would talk about it. And of course, there are many references to mathematics as well in Heidegger's work. But the point I'm trying to make is, whether it's philosophical modernism or literary modernism, there's a very strong usage of time being relativized. Does it mean the same thing that it means in science and literature? No. But a notion of relativizing the category of time is nevertheless loosely present in two different ways in Einsteinian physics and in the kind of literature that talks about this notion of deep time, sometimes species time, psychological time, time that defeats the chronological movement of factory time, and so on. But, and I mean, I'll just mention a very interesting essay by Paul Sheehan in, I think, the Bloomsbury Companion on Modernism, where Sheehan has written at length about the reception of the general relativity theory by artists, by writers, including someone like Joyce, and the way in which the Einsteinian idea of relativity of time could feature in that famous train episode of Ulysses. Anyway, without going in greater detail into that, just to expand our scope a little bit more and talk about art, modernist art in general. And Bauhaus is the movement I'm thinking about. And we have the great Wassily Kandinsky. In 1926, he not only writes a treatise on his own painting, clarifying his aesthetics, but of course, he does some magnificent work with lines and points and circles and so on, which is this famous work called Point and Line to Plane. But the reason I wanted to extract this opening section, in fact, of the treatise is that, again, we see how mathematics, geometry specifically speaking, has a certain loop with language. And mathematics and language coming together is something that we see within the history of mathematics as well. If you consider someone like, if you think about the impossibility theorem, or even going further back to Russell and the way Bertrand Russell talks about the paradoxes, there's always this question about the relationship between language and mathematics. Is mathematics endemic to language, human language, the language of words, phrases, sentences, syllables, and so on? Or is mathematics a metastructure, something that human beings come up with while discussing language? In a slightly more technical linguistic term, is mathematics a meta-language? Or is mathematics the very core logical substructure of language? I mean, this is a question that, in fact, haunted the Oulipian writers as well, whom we should be able to at least mention towards the end. But in Kandinsky, again, without reading the quote, what we see is the way he connects the zero dimensionality of the geometric point with silence. That brings us back to this particular relation between language and mathematics, or mathematical structure on the one hand, and human language on the other hand. If the zero dimensionality of the geometric point signifies silence, how do we relate that to the canvas, the white canvas, as a manifestation of silence, and the sort of etching on the canvas as a kind of mathematical writing, a mathematical inscription on a surface? So again, I mean, there's a lot to be said about this, perhaps cubism as well. We won't go into that. Okay, very briefly, Eliot. Of course, we cannot leave Eliot far behind. Again, I won't read through all these long quotes, but just to make the basic point I wanted to make, in this celebrated early modernist essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, we have Eliot quite directly talking about science, right? For example, if you look at this first paragraph here, and in fact, the essay clearly gestures towards an analogy between what he calls poetic impersonality, depersonalization in this first passage, and science. So it is in this depersonalization, I'm just reading this key sentence here, it is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Again, that desire that I was talking about, the desire for art and literature to acquire the status of science. Is it a desire simply for cultural value, for cultural privilege? That's a question to keep in mind. But Eliot clearly creates this kind of an analogy between creative impersonality, his famous idea of the distance or the gap between the self that suffers and the self that creates poetry, and this idea of, again, objectivity or impersonality of the sciences. He brings in a reference to chemistry, which is why I wanted to have this famous passage. Of course, many of you, most of you possibly would be familiar with the passage. But the interesting point is to think about the kind of implications for philosophy of science and art of science this kind of a passage would have. So again, he's talking about the notion of the catalyst, which doesn't change itself, but it changes the way the two gases react with one another, right? And he thinks of the poet's self, the creative self, as a kind of catalyst, which does not change itself. It triggers a kind of change in two other entities, but it does not change itself. It remains unchanged. And that's where, again, we come back to this idea of the invariant, the depersonalized, the distant. All these things have something to do with science in the thought process of Eliot's. And again, the famous essay on Joyce and Ulysses, where he famously talks about the mythical method, which is, of course, a contested term in the field of Joyce studies. Some scholars would say it's entirely wrong to think of it as a mythical method. But again, that's not the reason I wanted to have this quote up here. I wanted to have this quote for an obvious reason. As you can see, Einstein gets a mention here. So he's talking about someone like Joyce in the same breath as Einstein. Mr. Joyce is perceiving a method which others must pursue after him. So he's creating a framework, a creative narrative framework. They will not be imitators any more than the scientist who uses the discoveries of an Einstein in pursuing his own independent further investigations. So again, I would like to take these analogies between the artist and the scientist seriously and not, just see them as throwaway points of reference. Anyway, we have to move on just for the lack of time. Very briefly, to move into late modernism now. For some, the very beginnings of postmodernism. In 1960, with Oulipo, Ouvrier de littérature potentielle, we have a group of writers, some of whom are trained mathematicians. Someone like Jacques Roubaud was a trained mathematician. And others had a lot of interest. Of course, Raymond Queneau, but also someone like George Perec had a great interest in mathematics. So what we see here is 100 million poems. The point is, again, for those of you who are well aware of Oulipo, this will be a flat and fundamental point, of course, that they go to mathematical form in order to reinvent the formal experimental questions in literature. In fact, that's their idea of potential. They relate potentialities of literature, new possibilities of literature, with the idea of combinatorics, or the field of combinatorics within mathematics, right? Combinatorics is a field where, we talk about factorial law. So if there are, let's say, three elements, if there are three elements, there are 1 into 2 into 3 ways of arranging those 3 elements. If there are 4 elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, the maximum number of arrangements that are possible with 4 elements would be 1 into 2 into 3 into 4. Now, as you can see, what, in this magnificent book, which has now been digitally replicated in a certain sense, what Raymond Queneau does in 1960, and he's a sort of precursor to this entire group, and the guru of the group, so to speak, he writes 10 sonnets, as you can see, with the origamic play of page as a surface coming from the great Stéphane Mallarmé. We have this possibility where each line of each sonnet can also be replaced by the same line of the next sonnet, and the next sonnet, and the next sonnet, and so on. 10 sonnets, and because there are 14 lines in every sonnet, there are 10 to the power 14 sonnets potentially present in the book. So there are many more sonnets. In fact, you could think of it like a sonnet machine, a sonnet factory, or a sonnet machine. So the idea is the reader is invoked and, in fact, compelled in a way to read these poems in all possible permutations and combinations, where each line of each poem may also be the same line of the next poem, and so on, right? As I just said. Just to, again, I don't think we have the time, I'll be aware of it, but Queneau was interested in number theory, so much so that he developed a particular kind of structure of numbers. I won't go into this because it'll take up a lot of time, called the S additive series. And he actually invented this particular mathematical formulation, which he sent out to mathematical journals, and they got it was accepted, etc. So this is something that Rubot talks at length about, this amateur but serious interest in mathematics. Rubot being the mathematician talking about Kino. Markov's chain is a structure that Oulipians refer to in their manifestos. I won't go deep into it, but as you can understand, they are interested in mathematical forms. Mathematical forms that in this case, of course, as you can see in the example, have a certain use in economics, in the field of economics. This is, of course, the great George Perec and his greatest novel, perhaps, Life, a User's Manual. Again, I wouldn't dare to go into a discussion of this at this point with so little time left, but I just want to mention the structure that he uses. So he uses this particular problem from a game of chess called Knight's Tour. And the entire novel is about a house that has 100 rooms, but there are 99 chapters. So there's one, room missing, as it were, like the empty set, which is there in all sets. He doesn't go into a description or a story about that particular room. There are some other numerical plays in Life, a User's Manual that I don't have the time for, but I just want to mention that, he decided to structure the entire novel around a mathematical problem. And of course, the famous Oulipian method of constrained writing was used from mathematics, was picked up from mathematics. This idea that you create a restraint, like Perec did famously for La Disparition, or a void in English. Actually, the English title works better here. So what Perec did was to write a novel without the vowel E, which is also about the disparition or disappearance of a character named Anton Vowel without the E. So vowel without the E, V-O-W-L, right? So this decision to write without a vowel for the length of an entire novel was taken before the very composition of the novel. So there's a constraint or a restraint, and then there is a certain experimentation with that restraint to see how we can write a novel without this particular element. Like, for example, if someone decides, I'll write a novel which is restricted to the washroom of the protagonist, it will not get out of the bathroom or the washroom. Of course, it will significantly limit the narrative possibilities in that novel. But that's precisely what creates a certain experimental space. And this is coming from mathematics, right? But the point, and let me underline this point because I'm going back to this anti-systemic use of mathematics and science at large. Oulipians were very insistent on this, that constraints are ultimately not limitations. Constraints open up a kind of freedom, what they called, in a paradoxical usage of an expression, limited freedom or constrained freedom. In fact, they believed, though there is a certain tension with surrealism, and they are trying to go against the automatic unconscious writing of surrealism with a more structured procedural kind of writing, Oulipians also believed in aleatorics, the fact that literature is aleatory. Something will happen in literature by chance. There will be a chance occurrence of something. So on the one hand, there is structuration, a very keen eye for structuration. On the other hand, there is the possibility of something chancy happening in literature. And the drift of the use of science is always anti-systemic. I mean, it's again like the way Heidegger would critique cybernetic thinking. We have a piece by Calvino where he makes a similar critique of cybernetic thinking. This is a more complex iteration of the Knight's Tour. So you can understand the kind of structure that he uses. And this is from the notes of Perec's, where he's trying to create the structure of the rooms and the inhabitants of all these 99 rooms in Life, a User's Manual. There's one, sorry, just give me 1 second. I thought I had another, just give me 1 second. I might have it somewhere else. Yeah, I'll just finish with that last example. How are we doing for time? I think we have overshot the time a little bit, right?
I don't think time is much of a problem here. So
okay.
Please carry on. Yes.
Sure.
We are all ears to you. Yeah.
I'll try and wrap up soon though. I'll just check if I have it here. Yes. Because I didn't really talk about physics. So let me just, sorry, let me just finish by talking about physics. Right. So this is Virginia Woolf, The Waves. But before that, again, a very famous passage from Woolf's The Modern Fiction, the essay on the modern fiction from 1921. Again, this is a very oft-quoted passage. Most of you would be familiar with this. I'm just trying to extract the important idea of atom. So the way this passage is usually read, and rightly so, is a critique of realism, realism going inward, realism becoming more and more psychological in that sense, the little things of life becoming more important than the big ones, chronological time giving way to a kind of deep psychological time. And most importantly, as Woolf says, let me read this part at least, the mind receives myriad impressions, and there's a sort of multiplicity of impressions in the mind. But then there are these atoms. The image of the atom is extremely important. There are these atoms that are falling in the mind. And as Woolf suggests, we cannot reorder the atoms. We have to listen to them in the same rhythm in which they fall, in the same order in which they fall. Rather than trying to realistically reorder reality, we have to assume and receive reality as it is, with all its automatism, with all its contingency, with all its randomness. But this idea of, again, just to pick out the sentence, from all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, and as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of, and then she talks about time, Monday, Tuesday, and so on, the accent falls differently from of old. The moment of importance came not here, but there. So that if a writer were a free man and not a slave, if he could write what he chose, not what he must, if he could base his work upon his own feeling and not upon convention, and she goes on like that. But the important point is, let us record, let me just read this part, the end. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. So let us not try and reorder the sequence of atoms. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness. Right? I'll stop there with this particular quote, but again, we have to take this metaphor coming from physics seriously. If we go to the work of Michel Serres, the French philosopher of science, Serres has made this very persuasive argument, giving mathematical value to Greek pre-Socratic materialism. Even though there is no direct reference, Woolf is in all likelihood gesturing towards, and she was very well versed with philosophy in general, she's gesturing towards this particular theory of Lucretius in pre-Socratic atomism, where the world is understood as the product of a chance encounter between atoms as they vertically fall on a void. So there's a parallel fall of two lines of atoms, and suddenly they swerve. The technical term for this is clinamen. They suddenly swerve and come into contact with one another. So in this wall of atoms on the void, when two atoms meet each other and create a kind of molecular chain, as it were, that's when the world comes into being. This is the Lucretian, vision, let's say, of pre-Socratic materialism. But what Serres does is to make this into a rigorous theory of physics. Traditional physicists would not take this seriously and would not take this as the very birth of atom in the history of science. They would perhaps treat this more as a sort of folkloric idea of the atom, mythological idea of the atom. Whereas with Dalton, and again with a certain accent on scientific modernity, we have the beginnings of atomism. So what Serres does is to bridge this gap between modernist atomism, Dalton and others, and of course that becomes more and more complicated with subatomic particles of physics and so on, and even more so with string theory, etc., without going into all those things. But the important point that I'm trying to make here is that this is something that helps someone like Virginia Woolf in her work to go around this idea of a group or a collectivization. In fact, my interests in Beckett and Calvino, to a large extent, is around the political dynamic of number, where number and the old Platonic dialectic between the one and the many becomes a way of thinking about the two conditions, the two basic human conditions: one, solitude; two, company. So aloneness on the one hand, and being with others on the other hand. One as the one of solitude, to one as the one of community, a collectivization. Very interestingly, for someone like Virginia Woolf in this late masterpiece, The Waves from 1931, the atom becomes a way of thinking about self-division, but also it becomes a way of thinking about the group as a collective. Now, again, I can't go into the details about the novel, but if we read seriously the references to both atoms, which are there throughout the novel, and also, I mean, literally as well as metaphorically, and also there are multiple references to Lucretius, whom I just mentioned as the central philosopher of pre-Socratic atomism. Now, if we read something like The Waves from 1931, in tandem with the work of Michel Serres, and what he's arguing essentially is that we could mathematically think about pre-Socratic atomism in a sort of rigorous way. It's not just a throwaway mythology of atoms. Now, when atoms come together and form molecular patterns, again, we are talking about a certain relation of the individual with the group. But do the atoms retain their own character invariably in the molecular chain? Not always. And that's where the problem, sort of gets concentrated in a certain sense. And Serres goes at length to talk about hydraulic problematics in modern physics. And essentially the move that he makes is to also, I mean, again, let's not go too much into this. Let me just come back to The Waves and conclude with this, with these two passages, essentially talking about a problem where, again, science, mathematics, and physics together open up a problem of counting, a problem of including oneself in the group, of thinking about the tension between the one and the many, the one of solitude and the one of the group as another kind of unified one. And Woolf quite literally was part of the Bloomsbury group and negotiating these very complex social experiments that they were doing as a group, defying a lot of social practices because, of course, they had certain kinds of privileges. Let's not be unaware of that. Now, in The Waves, which is Woolf's most plotless novel, perhaps, to make a slightly reductive point, towards the end, in the final chapter, both these quotes are taken from the final chapter, and we have Bernard talking here. Bernard is perhaps the most central character who gets to talk the most in the novel. But as you know, if you have read The Waves, it's a book that constantly alternates without any narrative, so to speak, from one voice to another among this, very complex group dynamic that we have and how these friends grow old over a period of time. There's also this absent character that everyone seems to be in love with, Percival. I won't go into that. But if we look at these two passages, we see a problem that comes with the evocation of atomism, the problem of collectivization, the problem of forming a group. In the first one, as Bernard says, I'm not one person, I'm many people. I do not altogether know who I am, Jenny, Susan, Neville, Rhoda, or Louis, or how to distinguish my life from others. What we notice here is that there is no mention of Bernard. So Bernard is talking and he's excluding himself from the group when he's talking about the collectivity of the group. He's mentioning everyone else except himself. So Jeannie, Susan, Neville, Rhoda, Louis, 5 of them get a mention, but not himself. And yet the question is, there is no one self. It's a group self. It's a group consciousness. There's a multiplication of the self. So what I'm essentially trying to say, that's the first point I'm making here, that the atom becomes a scientific support for this notion of the divided self. The fact that we can think of the self in a divisible manner. That's the first point, and maybe an elementary point. But if we look at the next slightly longer quote, and let me read it because it's important. And now I ask, who am I? I've been talking of Bernard, Neville, Ginny, Susan, Rhoda, and Louis. Am I all of them? Am I one and distinct? I do not know. We sat here together, but now Percival is dead and Rhoda is dead. We are divided. We are not here. Yet I cannot find any obstacle separating us. There is no division between me and them. As I talked, I felt I am you. This difference we make so much of, this identity we so feverishly cherish, was overcome. So there's an overcoming of individual identity and a certain movement towards group identity. But what is striking is that, and these two quotes are taken from the same chapter, as I say, they happen in a space of 5 to 10 pages. So there's not much of a gap between the two. In the first one, there is a self-exclusion. Bernard never mentions himself. In the second one, he includes himself as he's talking about the group self. And that, brings us to the second point that I'll finish with, again, an anti-systemic use of science, where the scientific logic of addition creates this +1. So when we think of 6 people together, is it a 7? Is the group of the order of an extra number? I mean, I'm trying to be as simple as possible and not going into the mathematical technicalities of the +1 here, or what is called the 1 multiple in mathematics and mathematical physics, in fact. But the essential point I'm trying to make is that when we form a group, do we see the group as a +1 entity? How do we count it? Or do we see the group as an embedded entity? If there are 6 people forming a group, does that make a 7? Or do we remain at the level of the 6? Now, what happens in these two hesitant acts of collectivization from Bernard is that in the first occurrence, it's 5. In the second occurrence, it becomes 6. So there's a self-inclusion that adds a 1. But this +1, in a way, implies the other +1, where Bernard, Neville, Ginny, Susan, Rhoda, and Louis, all of them together, can make another +1, the group being the +1, the 7. So again, if we look at set theory and group theory as mathematical elaborations, and the kind of influence they had, especially the kind of influence that Cantor had, Cantor's idea of transfinite numbers, what is called the continuum, the Cantor continuum, the diagonal method, or the way the naive theory of sets was proposed in the 60s by this group with a pseudonym, Nicholas Bourbaki. It was a group of mathematicians together who wrote this book, the Theory of the Sets, which was quite a revelation for many writers and inspired a lot of writers. Another mathematician who had a lot of influence on the Philippians was Gilbert, the Gilbert of Gilbert space, who again tried to popularize geometry with shapes and colors and origami and making images within, photographic images in the Pop Maths book that he wrote, at least on geometry and imagination is I think the name of Gilbert's book. But anyway, Gilbert introduced this idea of the axiomatic method, which became very important for the Olympians, because Olympians were trying to mathematically axiomatize literature. Why do I mention this? Because there is something like axiomatization happening here. But the problem is the axiomatization is not falling into a completely self-consistent system. In fact, we encounter that famous Russell's paradox between completeness and consistency, which was then radicalized in the impossibility theorems of Kurt Gödel, who again became very, very important for a lot of modernist writers. This idea that mathematics is not necessarily a self-enclosed system, but an incomplete system, if at all, became quite important for modernism or modernist writers who were trying to open up through science rather than close down the system of the text with the help of science. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arkoda, for this wonderful talk. I mean, my dear colleague Oritra will take the questions, but I cannot but jump in and kind of think about this talk to be renamed as the proof and paradox, if you know what I mean. Yeah, right. So over to Oritra for the questions we have for this session. And thank you so much for this enlightening talk. Arkoda.
Thank you.
Firstly, thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for this very enlightening talk. During your talk, you mentioned that 1 million sonnets, right? Where it could be read in any kind of permutation and combination. I couldn't help but notice, I saw something very similar on, I don't remember, on one of the social medias, where an AI bot was shown a significant amount of Batman films and then was asked to write 1 page of Batman script. I think that is very similar to what you have proposed here, right? So I just remembered that as an anecdote to what you have said. So the first question is by Pradipto or Pradipta Mondal, I'm not very sure. They ask, so in this era of insecurity where everyone is sort of trying to make others believe what he or she believes, how do we teach ourselves to accept the coexistence of literary subjectivity and scientific objectivity?
Wow, okay, that's a big question, right? With very strong ethical injunctions and connotations. I don't know whether I'm equipped enough to answer that question, because it's a question about ethics of the subject and the object, right? I'll just try and respond to the question in a certain way. Thank you very much, by the way, to both Rishiraj and Oritra for your perceptive comments. Indeed, it was about paradox and proof. And yeah, I mean, some of those digital humanities and pop cultural spins have been given to Oulipo specifically as a sort of experiment as well. So it's very relevant what you mentioned there. To not answer, but to respond to Pradipto or Pradipta's question. Honestly, it's a very, very tricky divide, right? I mean, if you bring in the question of ideological belief, again, let me go back to the point I started with, that we like to think science is non-ideological, but it's not, you know? In fact, I'll just mention one of our colleagues' very interesting recent books, one of the very recent books to have discussed this in the Indian context. Rennie Thomas, Professor Rennie Thomas, who teaches in IISER Bhopal, has a new book on caste and religion and science in India. The title of the book, the exact title of the book escapes me, but this is exactly what he's trying to show through field work and his ethnography, that, you know, we might think that a scientist is neutral, but they're not. You know, the kind of social, political background they come from, the kind of ideological beliefs they have, gets, you know, quite central to the making of the kind of science practice they have in their life, right? So again, I mean, science is not objective. That's the first thing to keep in mind. If we think about the scientists, the figures of the scientists, and also the way they construct science. But that is not to say the formulations of science cannot be objective. Of course, they can be objective. But it's a very subjective way in which that objectivity itself is crafted, like a means which is subjective, and the end, at least the goal, is objective, right? So it's very difficult to think of these two things separately. But one very quick point to close this response to your question, which is very difficult to answer, honestly speaking, is that when we think about another way of approaching the object that becomes quite important for late modernism, something like the French Nouveau Roman, the new novel, right? And the way someone like Alain Robert-Grillet talks about the object in literature, not as objectivity, but literature trying to engage with the surface reality of material objects. This is his famous point that we have psychologized objects too much. In the 60s, when he writes the notes towards the new novel, we have kind of seen them as these inordinate depths. What about thinking about them as material, formal structures with surfaces? So object becomes that kind of a notion. And of course, someone like Roland Barthes was quite obsessed with Grieg and has written so much about objects in literature. In one of the translations, it comes across as objective literature, but I would perhaps prefer objectal literature than objective. Anyway, you could look up certainly those essays by Barthes on Robert Grieg, but also Robert Grieg's own fantastic essays that are, I think, collected in the form of the new novel or essays on the new novel in the English translation. Yeah, thank you.
We have a question from the Facebook Live. I will read it out. It's by Shushmita Bhattacharya. She asks, do you think that literature was inclined towards science much before modernism started, such as in the works of Swift and Goethe? Also, I was curious regarding the fact that as Romanticism focused on imagination and later on influenced many psychoanalysts, so the urge to include science in literature was present throughout the entire period. I should want to know your opinion about this.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, quite brilliant, but very difficult to answer, to be honest. A simple answer is, of course, yes. There's no doubt that literature had interfaces with science that go back, many years, many centuries, in fact, than modernism, right? So modernism is something that some of us are working on, which is why I was talking about that. But having said that, I think it also assumes a particular historical urgency in modernism, this relation between science and literature, which was there, as you rightly pointed out. But I don't think it assumed that kind of cultural, it was latently present, but it didn't assume that kind of cultural primacy where, there was on the one hand this desire to be a science. This is classic in Freud, right? There's a desire to be a science, but then there's also a realization of not being a science. But anyway, coming back to literature, maybe there is a desire to acquire the condition of science, but at the same time, there's also a skepticism about scientific objectivism, as we saw in Zara, and he's not the only one. In fact, even when we are talking about, to use a Lacanian word, the conjectural sciences, if at all, like psychoanalysis, in his great novel, Malloban, there's a wonderful dialogue between Malloban and his wife, where Malloban, in fact, says something to the effect, I can't quote, but something to the effect that, by the way, do you know this chap called Freud? He seems to think we can know everything about the human mind. That is ridiculous. It's bizarre. So again, we go back to exactly that particular tension that you talked about in your great question. In fact, that there is a certain, at least a commonplace understanding of tension between imagination and science, which of course scientists wouldn't take it very nicely if we say it to them, right? Because of course it's an imaginative pursuit in their own right. But at the same time, to again close my response, I would say, yes, it has always been there. There's absolutely no doubt about that. There are reference number as far back as, at least in my knowledge, there's references to number in Beowulf too, and very interesting references to number and numericity in Beowulf. So it's always been there. But there's a certain historical potentiality it acquires, because the first half of 20th century is when all these, massive discourses of science become culturally so powerful. And literature has to engage with that, but also in a sense, combat the positivist ghost of science. Stop there.
Thank you for your very thoughtful response. Rishiraj, would you like to take up some of the questions now?
Yes. Sure, we have quite a few number of questions, it seems. They're piling up. Vikram asks, so as we have said, modernism was influenced by mathematics and scientific logic, but why modernist movements like Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism are very illogical, surrealist, dreamy, irrational, nonsensical, fragmentary? That's a very interesting question, seems.
Yeah. No, that's a good question too. So surrealism, Dadaism, and futurism. I think these were the three mentions, right? Okay. Yeah. So what is very interesting is that, again, perhaps in the question there is an assumption that science and logic are the same thing, but not necessarily, right? In fact, a large group of mathematicians would like to differentiate between mathematics and logic as well. It's only the logicists who would say mathematics is logic, someone like Bertrand Russell. But that's not the only position on the mathematics logic relation. So there is no hard sort of, let's say, opposition between acquiring, or at least having the desire to acquire, a scientific status and being, I wouldn't say illogical, but counter logical. Because the surrealists' interest in Freud and psychoanalysis, in fact, if you go through the manifesto, what becomes very interesting is that, at least in the Breton manifesto, surrealists take it as a certain part of science, as a sort of experimental extension of science. So Freudian psychoanalysis, for Breton, at least in the Surrealist Manifesto, is an extension of science. That's the first thing to note. The second is, yes, there's a certain notion of surrealism as, this belief in an absolute reality. Again, a very important statement that Breton makes in that same manifesto. So reality is a sort of absolute reality as a combination of dream and reality. But again, let's not misunderstand and think that dream is illogical. Dream is actually more logical than anything else in our lives. In fact, our lives are much more illogical than our dreams. So dream and the entire sort of elaboration of psychoanalysis is to talk about logics of the unconscious. And of course, as a Lacanian, again, I could talk for a few days on that, so I wouldn't go into that. But that's the way I would perhaps respond to your question. There's also a lot of other things that I didn't talk about, like, for example, Vorticism. Again, a movement that was very strongly influenced by mathematics. There was a manifesto called Poetry is Vertical. So verticalism and vorticism are different. So verticalism is another clear site of influence, at least in certain loose senses, of mathematical ideas coming into the domain of poetry. Futurism is a little bit different, partially also because of their politics, I suppose, Marinetti and their sort of association with Italian fascist politics. Dadaism, as we said, yes, Dadaism is perhaps very anarchist and, in a certain sense, most critical of science, of the different groups that we mentioned today. But having said that, this negative reaction against science is also an engagement with science. That's the reason why I had that particular passage from Zara. There is a need to react against science, as it were. Let's stop there, because it's otherwise going to really sprawl.
Great. And our next question, which kind of reminds me of Alan Sokal. Literature is said to be pseudoscience. Now it seems science too is pseudo-narrative. PJ Thomas asks you to comment on this, please.
This is a very good question. It's more of a comment, of course, and I would entirely agree with you there, the one who's asking the question, that yes, I mean, science is also a form of narrative. I don't know whether it's pseudo, because, of course, from a literary point of view, one might say those kinds of things. And the notions of truth in literature and science do remain quite starkly opposed sometimes, despite all those things. But again, if we mention somebody I didn't, again, for obvious reasons, because there's no way I could do justice to his thinking, someone I didn't mention in this talk, Alan Badiou. Someone like Alan Badiou's project is precisely this, right? An anti-systemic mobilization of science to talk about the world And again, to go into this idea that science gives us, so for Badiou, mathematics is ontology, right? Uh, uh, Mathematics is ontology. What does that mean? Mathematics is the science of being qua being. And then when he talks about phenomenology being qua appearing, again, he uses category theory to sort of settle that idea of phenomenology. So, I mean, Badiou would be a very, I think, important example when we are thinking of these anti-systemic mobilizations of mathematics specifically, but also physics, looking at his corpus. Uh, I won't go further into this, but I would more or less agree with the comment that was made in the question. Thank you.
Right, and someone asks, Ritish Dotto asks, as the self is divided or fragmented, how does the idea of the one or plus one contribute to it? Is the fragmentation quantifiable?
Again, a very, very perceptive question. Thank you for that. So, no, I mean, it doesn't necessarily at least mean that division or fragmentation is quantifiable. In fact, that's the irony, right? On the one hand, we are talking about fragmentation. On the other hand, at least in the example that I mentioned with Virginia Woolf, and there's a little bit of this, even though the deep end of this is very different, but there's a little bit of this in Beckett's great novel, How It Is, Como Se, this hesitation between the one and the many, or the solitude and the company, so to speak, which is essentially the question of community building, right? M.H. Abrams has this great book on literary communities, which again goes back to, of course, not that the book is entirely about modernism, but it is produced in the literary critical period of modernism. That's why I mentioned it. But to go back to your question, it's a very complex question. First of all, I'm not talking about quantifiability as the paradigm of mathematics, because if we are talking about quantification as the paradigm of mathematics, that's precisely where I don't want to go, because that's positivism, right? Everything is quantifiable. That's the basic ideological structure of positivism, or the way we think about data post-humanism, human subject as data, human subject as big data transporting across space. Of course, in a certain sense, we are. I'm not denying that, because we are in a big data framework right now as I speak. And I speak to you through that big data framework in a sense. So the point is not to deny these things, but to take them on board and then see whether they can be ruptured. So this idea of a calculable rationality or calculative rationality, if you think about the great work of Adorno and Horkheimer, in Dialectics of Enlightenment, they villainize mathematics for being this calculative rationality model. Fair enough, but at the same time, that's precisely where the question lies. Is mathematics as a discourse reducible to calculative rationality? I would like to think it's not. And that's where we come back to your question, that the fragmentation is not quantifiable, but there is an attempt to quantify the collectivization of fragments. So there's fragmentation first in the waves, and then there is an attempt to, collectivize or defragment, as it were. But what I wanted to focus, and that kind of goes back to your question, I think, is the failure of that quantification. It's a failure. It's not a success. That's precisely why the first time it's a 5, the second time it's a 5 plus 1, 6, assuming there is a 6 plus 1, 7 of the group. So there's already, we are going into proliferation, and it's not systematizable, that collectivization, right? So it's not quantifiable, is exactly what I kind of sharpened the point that I perhaps didn't make as clearly as I should have.
I think we have our next question from Dipanwita. The question reads, as there is a strong influence of science on literature and other arts, was there a simultaneous influence of literature on science or narrativization of science, except psychoanalysis like physics, chemistry, and maths?
Again, a brilliant question. That deserves a talk, Dipanwita, on its own. That deserves a talk. But yes, absolutely. I did not go into it, and it's great that you pointed it out, because it is, I was aware that this is a sort of lacuna, but there's only so much we can do. And I was also aware of the fact that this is primarily a literature group. I would have perhaps done this a little bit differently had it been a science engineering group, which is the one I teach more often than not, right? Being in an IIT. So very quickly, yes, I mean, there's, for example, a kind of number called surreal number, right? So there is at least some influence. It's not perhaps as expansive as it is the other way around, partially because of that cultural hierarchy of the sciences on top of art or on top of literature. But at the same time, we do know, especially if we think of art in the larger sense, the kind of interests a lot of mathematicians had when it comes to music, especially, right? And also literature in a certain sense, especially with someone like Cantor again. There are references to literature in the work of major mathematicians. I won't go into a sort of catalog of that, and I can't really give too many examples off the top of my head, but there's this famous French mathematician who has actually written quite a bit about the role of imagination in mathematics, and I can't, the name escapes me right now. But anyway, there's the great lectures on symmetries by a mathematical physicist talking about architecture and literature at length. Not literature, sorry, architecture and art at length. So there is a lot of engagement from the other end too, but it's primarily illustrative of science. So far in my research, that's what I've found, which is again very interesting. It's like, okay, I have a scientific theory, and I'm going to use literature to prove that I'm correct. That's not exactly how literateurs often use science. And that's why that use becomes a little more dialectical, I feel. But of course, this is a generalization. There might be some scientists using it in a much more open form, than the ones I have in mind. But one very quick last point to this question: when we think about the influence of literature, not just literature, broadly speaking, arts on scientists, we can also think about a larger question, the question of their life story and how that life story becomes a narrative of its own. If you think about Cantor's letter to the church, when he felt guilty of having discovered something like an actual infinity, because it goes against this idea, this dogmatic religious idea that the only infinity can be held by something like God. A divine structure can be infinite. Nothing else could be infinite, right? So he was so guilty and he felt so ashamed of his own discovery, in a sense, that he had to write a letter of apology to the church. These are very interesting narrative contexts. His lifelong struggle with mental illness. Same with Godel. Godel believed in ghosts, was so paranoid at the end of his career that he thought anyone, if he steps out of the apartment, out of his house, there are people out there to kill him. So if we think about the kind of life narratives, I'm specifically thinking of mathematicians because I'm most interested by them, but I'm sure we could talk about others too. Someone like Banville has written a lot, very creatively, very interestingly, about the life of physicists. Especially someone like Newton, for example, right? And again, I mean, what he has highlighted very interestingly is Newton's sort of sudden descent into madness, as it were, in the exchange of letters he had, which were mildly bizarre with Kant. Anyway, I won't go into more narratives, but there is that way of looking at the literature of science, right? Because the scientist's life itself becomes a work of fiction, a life narrative.
Thank you. That was quite the answer. Our next question, no, it's not a question. It's asking for your comment on another comment, which is, there was mere professional reason also to integrate science into literature. They mean for survival of literature departments. If you would like to comment on this.
Yeah. Okay. This might become like a series of rants, so I would rather not go into it. But yeah, I mean, the very fact that this could produce a series of rants in a way gives value to your question, right? there is a certain rationalization that as a mega or meta narrative we have to follow, even when we think about literary studies, because broadly speaking, everything is considered scientific in research, even when you're not talking about science. So there is that larger question of rationality, instrumental rationality, and what rationality has become in the
Hello. I think sir is stuck.
Yeah, I believe Dr.
He's
Yeah. He's back. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm back now. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any more questions?
Okay, let me see. I might have one. I can see there's one. Is scientific fiction just to show that there is a relation between science and literature, or is there any other rationale to that? Yeah.
Is it a question about science fiction or scientific fiction? I didn't get that part very clearly.
Scientific fiction, that's what she writes. Yeah, I'm not sure what she means.
So, Rishi, could you read that once more, please? Yeah.
Is scientific fiction written by writers just to show that there is a relationship between science and literature? Is it the only reason, or there is more to that?
Yeah. No, I think I got it now. Okay. Again, another reason why I didn't talk about science fiction, because my unconscious prompted me there. So let me quickly respond to that. Science fiction wasn't necessarily the form in literary modernism, right? It became more of a subversive form in what we consider postmodern, right? There, it became much more important as a sort of high literary form as well in writers like Philip K. Dick and others, right? But at the same time, it was kind of not disregarded, but at least it wasn't considered the form when it comes to formal experimentations within modernism, which is another reason why I didn't go into that. But very quickly, your question is about scientific fiction, which means something else. No, it's not just about the fact that they want to relate the two. As I said, there are some organic connections. Literary form takes writers to scientific form in a certain sense, if I may put it like that, because there is no such thing as a pure literary form. Forms are, forms. They don't belong to either literature or science for that matter. One could say the ultimate theory of forms comes from Plato. Now, who is he? A philosopher, a scientist, a literary writer? All three, I would claim. Right? I mean, who could write dialogues like him? And that's the beginning of theater in a sense, right? So again, to go back to the question, I would say it's an attempt to see the kind of relations between science and literature when somebody wants to engage with that. But the kind of relations it produces will be very different from work to work, from writer to writer, from one tradition to another. I mean, as I said, again, without claiming a kind of a meta narrative like this, what I'm interested is to probe this point whether the use of science in literary modernism, the experimental use of scientific discourse, could be considered an anti-systemic and counter-instrumentalist use. That's the argument I'm trying to push forward. But I'm sure there'll be other scholars saying something else. That's the beauty of research, right?
Sir, I only made this question, sir.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sir, actually, I want to say that I have typed a bit wrong while typing, that we come across various science fiction, we read science fiction. So is the science fiction are written, is it just an attempt made by the writers to combine both science and literature? This is what only I want to know.
Yeah, no, I got your question. No, I think, yes, of course it is. There is absolutely no disagreement on that point. But what is this relation, right? For a science fiction writer like Asimov or someone like H.G. Wells, it might be very different from the kind of, if at all we have to call it science fiction, it's more like speculative fiction in the sort of modernist lineage of someone like Don DeLillo, right? Who writes, works that could be loosely classified under some form of speculative fiction or science fiction, but the purposes are very different. And also because they come from very different sort of spheres of life. I mean, Asimov is a scientist, right? That's his first and foremost identity. And I mean, literature becomes for him a very interesting extension of his scientific identity, his identity as a scientist. So that's exactly what I'm trying to say, that the relation between science and literature, opened up by even science fiction as a genre, would be very different depending on the tradition of writing it comes from. With Don DeLillo, it's very different from A.G. Wells, or with Asimov. Again, it's very different because Asimov takes it into very ethical sort of questions of robotics, for example, which is where his work becomes really interesting, getting into those ethical conundrums of robotics, let's say. Wales is more interested in culturalizing science, but I think all these writers are doing that at a certain basic level, creating a cultural narrative around science, which is about, not science itself, but how science is disseminated across the different professional spheres of society. Because, of course, not everyone will understand the technicality of E is equal to MC square, right? I mean, that would take some technical expertise. But at the same time, what could that mean for, let's say, the idea of speed or the idea of momentum, which are ideas that, for example, just to give a very tangential example here, this is a question that Divya Divedi and Shaj Mohan have read into the ontology of Gandhi, thinking about Gandhi as a philosopher who talks about speed ontology. Now, if you conflate that with the way speed and momentum are characterized in Einstein, that's not really the conflation they're making. But I'm just saying the idea can always move from one field to another, right? And speed is something that, of course, philosophers have talked about. Momentum is something philosophers have talked about in their own ways. Mass, again, is something that philosophers have talked about in their own ways, very different perhaps from the Einsteinian sort of formulation. But I hope that kind of at least gives some direction to your question.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm just reminded of so many things. Paul Virilio, perhaps, aesthetics of disappearance, yes. The mass is disappearing, so on and so forth. Yes, since we don't have other questions, the other questions we have, let not ask them, because they primarily center around the relationship between science and literature now, with cyborgs, algorithms, etc. Since we are limiting ourselves to a discussion on modernism, so let me not ask them, and perhaps conclude this session with a few of mine, perhaps, if you would kindly respond. I was thinking about how the problem of identity is relevant to mathematics and literature.
Yes, now I think I've unmuted. Yes.
Right.
Sorry about that interruption. Yeah.
No problem. I was asking that, but could you please talk about, since we are wrapping up this session, a bit about the idea of identity, how Husserl would. I'm just thinking of so many things. Husserl was a mathematician. Then you have Descartes, and you talked about music, Wagner. My goodness, I mean, how all the philosophers go back to Wagner and think about its structures, and we have the whole array of modernist writers thinking through modernist music, so to speak, the whole segment of modernist classical music, opera music. So how you think about the idea of identity mathematical identity and the identity of characters. You talked about characters, how they change, characters, how they're alone in solitude and in company. So if you briefly talk about the idea of identity in science and in the literary modernism, so to speak.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. Again, it's very deep and very important, of course. I don't think I'll have a very subtle and sophisticated answer, I'm afraid, because that's precisely the point I'm still sort of working towards and working on. Of course, in certain ways, there could be simple definitions of a mathematical subject who has a professional identification with the field, as I said, as a mathematician or as a pedagogue of mathematics. But there could also be these everyday mathematicians, as I said, handling OTP, handling basic calculations and things like that in the current context, which opens up. And I mean, the field of counting is something that is almost universally there for human beings to do, throughout their lives in a certain way. Obsessional counting is another place we could go to think about how people resort to counting, sometimes to keep negative thoughts at bay. I mean, isn't it a very common, or wasn't it maybe not anymore, but it was a very common bedtime exercise that parents would give to their kids. There's like, back calculate from 100 to 1, and you'll fall asleep. You're having difficulties with sleeping, just do that, right? So there are all these very complicated psychosomatic, social, political dimensions of counting. I say political because, again, this whole idea of how do I belong in a group is a political question, ethnically, linguistically, nationally, regionally, right? So mathematics in that sense, in one way, has always been one of those fundamental forms to assert identity. Because either we think of identity as a whole, which is, again, some way in which mathematics comes into it, and even in a certain sense, this idea of matter in a physicist's way comes into it. And some of the sort of more recent works on new materialism and post-humanism in a certain sense, especially with Karan Barad, there is everything is worked out through philosophy of science, in fact, right? I mean, it's primarily on Niels Bohr that Barad bases her work, right? So again, there is that sort of movement through science, but at the same time, so that's about unity, subjective unity, but fragmentation is where, again, science comes in very strongly, be it through atomicity or molecularity, or the very idea of number creating a certain sense of fragmentation. The moment we say many, we realize, okay, what is many? For example, this is a beautiful question asked by J.M. Coetzee's David, the Jesus figure in the trilogy. What is many? Is it just two that becomes a many? How do you clarify that two is many? It's just one more, right? You just add a one to another one and you make a two, and you call that many? David doesn't quite like this idea of two as many. So again, I mean, we could go on and on, but let me just limit myself to saying that science or scientific notions, especially from mathematics and physics, and also chemistry, because that's why we're talking about interaction of matter, right? How matter interacts, or, Barad has this beautiful term that she uses, intraacts. There's an intraaction, she says, of matter. If we especially think of vibrant matter, the way new materialists talk about it. In fact, I didn't touch new materialism, but that's another very important site of contemporary engagement with physics, which can be, again, used in a certain sense to talk about modernist literature, because there are certain echoes there. Because these new materialists are going back to mathematicians or physicists that were operating at the same time as literary modernism, right? Again, someone like Bohr, for example. So I'll not bore you further and stop there, because I think it's been a long session and I'm sure everyone wants to have dinner.